We are again back in the Middle Ages, and this time in section 2, instead of looking at the early or the high or the low or the late Middle Ages, we'll be looking at feudalism and the manor economy. We're looking more specifically here, not so much at a specific time period, but more generally the Middle Ages itself, and this idea of what we call feudalism and how feudalism worked in society, in its structure of class and people, as well as what we call the manor economy. This is not a new idea. Many other empires or civilizations had really pretty much something like feudalism, including the Chinese. But the Middle Ages is very known for this time period, probably most specifically that many of us, descend from the Europeans. Our focus question stays the same, which is not on here, I need to add that, but what controls people? That's our focus question. What controls people? So maybe I'll do that right now while I'm here. But we're still looking at, and we talked a little bit briefly about the church and the medieval church. Now we're going to be more specifically talking about how did the Middle Ages in government and economics and society and structure control people. Our first objective then is what social structures existed at this time. Feudalism, everyone has a place. Everybody knows exactly what they're supposed to be doing. So we'll be looking at that. In objective 2, how did the empires gain more resources? We have a lot of warring Germanic tribes trying to get more and more resources which are scarce. How are they going to get these resources? What are they going to do to get the resources that they need for their empires? And objective 3, what was life like for the majority of people at this time period? We talk so much about people like Charlemagne and Joan of Arc and all sorts of other famous people, which we should. But what about your everyday people like you and me, people that will never be known to history, that came, lived, and worked, and then died? What about those people? What was life like for them? So let's look at, I included with this one some of the vocab. I'm not going to spend the time necessarily to go through all of them, but I want to talk just about a couple of them here. So feudalism is a loosely organized system of rule in which powerful local lords divided their lands among lesser lords. So you have a king or a very powerful lord at top, and then underneath him he would have many smaller lords who he gave land to in order for them to have their own little small kingdoms, as long as they were willing to be taxed and willing to fight for the major lord. A vassal then would have been one of those lesser lords. Vassal is a lesser lord who pledges his loyalty to the greater lord. So if I'm the greater lord and you are a vassal, you're pleading your allegiance to me, your land, your people to fight, some of your resources and some of your production. That would have been done under what we call a feudal contract. A feudal contract is when pledges were made between a higher lord and a vassal. And a vassal would have had a fief or a fief, which is an estate. The peasants worked the land. Many of those fiefs would be working the land, and many of those peasants would have worked. And we'll talk about serfs and freemen later. But to protect those people, they would have had knights. Knight is literally translated to mounted warrior, a man on top of a horse who can fight. Those men would have trained at tournaments or mock battles where they could learn and hone in those skills, make sure that they were the best of the best, so that way when they actually had to go fight, they would be ready. And they also lived by something called chivalry. Chivalry is a code of conduct. That's why sometimes maybe your mom says, hey, be chivalrous, or chivalry is not dead. She's saying you as a young man need to be living a certain way towards women in your life. Hopefully you are that way. At this time period, yes, that would be what it meant, but it also was a code that knights would have lived. They had to be brave, they had to be loyal, true to their word, and they had to fight fairly. No sucker punches, no pulling hair, scratching, biting. Be a man. Fight correctly, kind of the idea there. There's also a manor. A manor would have been the lord's estate. And I said to you guys, a serf is somebody that was bound to land. They're not quite slaves, but sometimes that distinction between slave and serf is pretty fine. A serf was considered basically property. They were part of the property there, although they were protected with certain things. They had to be provided for. They had to have shelter, things like that. But many people would be serfs. There would also be freemen, which is not on here, but a freeman would be a peasant, somebody who worked the farm with serfs, but could come and go as they wanted. They had freedom. They were not tied to the land per se. And we'll be talking a little bit about Eleanor of Aquitaine, who became the first queen of France and later a queen of England. And so we'll be talking about her. And later you guys will be looking at Joan of Arc, another famous woman. We'll be looking at two really famous women that were very powerful in both their work in the Middle Ages as well as their legacies after. So let's talk a little bit about what makes, feudalism, what makes an actual hero at this time period. So with all these different kings and people fighting, smaller groups realized that they were too weak to maintain law and order in Europe. So what could they do other than give allegiance to a higher ranking king that had more of a military in hope that they would be able to go and be protected by them, get their resources from them. And so many of them will go into feudalism on their own accord. They will not be forced into feudalism. And in order to protect them from this invasion, they developed this system of feudalism. The idea of we're stronger in numbers than by ourselves. If you are out on the weekend and you and your friends get into a fight, you definitely want to have your best friends with you, and as many as possible, right? So this is this idea of feudalism. Feudalism then is, like I already said, a loosely organized system of rule in which powerful local lords divided their land holdings among lesser lords. Those lesser lords would be called vassals. And they would exchange those vassals a pledge to the higher lords, a service that they would, one, protect the higher lords if the higher lords called upon them, two, that they would give them some of their production of food, clothing, or other things like that, and three, that they would pay taxes to the greater lord. And in exchange, the greater lord would give these vassals money, or not money, I'm sorry, but give them land that they could have these things with. These mutual obligations between the higher lord and the lesser lords, the vassals, would be called a feudal contract, an exchange of pledges between the two lords. In a feudal contract, a lord granted his vassal a fief. We've kind of already talked about this with the vocab, or an estate, and would also give them peasants to work the land. If the peasants were actually tied to the land, then the lord would have them as serfs. If they were freemen, they would be called freemen. The lord promised to protect his vassal, and the vassal pledged loyalty to his lord. So here we have an example of serfs and freemen working a field. In this example here, we have serfs who are working and harvesting a crop. And as they are harvesting, they are being dictated by probably a freeman, or maybe even the lord himself, of the work that they need to do, that they need to continue to move forward, that they need to not take breaks, rise up and take a break for a second, take a breath, but need to keep working. They could have used these sticks possibly as a way to encourage their workers to be more productive, rather that be beating or hitting them with a stick. Now, this is a society of feudalism. The structure is, and everyone had a place in feudalism. Now, we may feel pity for these men that are working down here, and we probably should. I would definitely not have wanted to be one of them. But the nice thing at this time period is that everybody knows their place. It is highly organized. Unlike some of the empires we've talked about in the past, where people didn't know what their job was or what they were doing, in the Middle Ages, everybody knows what they're doing. Everybody has a job, and that's what you're supposed to do. And so if we continue down here, we can see the society and its structure here. And I'd like you to, in your notebook, make sure that you have basically this chart written in somewhere. It doesn't have to be as fancy. You don't have to do necessarily the drawings. But at the top, we would have a king, a very high lord. And the king owned lots and lots of land. And in that land, he would give it to what we would call nobles or vassals, to use the more vocabulary word. He would give them to vassals. And those vassals would have their fief. Their fief or fief would be used in order to give more and more of their own things to the king. Those nobles needed their lands protected. They needed their peasants and their serfs protected. And so they would hire mounted warriors or knights to do that. And these mounted warriors and knights would be fed and taken care of by the peasants. In return, the peasants provided the food and services for the knights. The knights provided protection and service for the peasants. The knights protected the nobles as well with military and service. And these noblemen or vassals gave money and production and knights in case of war to the king. And so everybody's benefiting off of each other. This is the feudal pyramid, if you want to call it that. And so make sure you've written that in your notebook. Take a pause for a second and write this into your notebook if you've not done that already. And we're going to skip this here. This is just kind of an activity for you guys to understand how it worked. A king with his lord was protected with knights and the vassals and the peasants. And it was just interlocked, as you can see. Everybody had their job and everyone worked together. I usually do an activity here where you can see how peasants were able to provide so much to the knights and to ultimately the vassal or king. Each peasant might provide 100 tacos each. Those tacos might be split to the knight, and the knight might give them to the lord. But you can see how everyone's benefiting off of each other here in this example. So when a rival lord would come and would want another lord's materials, their land, their peasants, their food, their production, they would fight. And really, in the Middle Ages, we see a lot of fighting constantly between the two different lords, fighting for power and for their material goods. Many of these nobles trained to be knights and to hire knights. And again, knight literally means mounted warrior. Mounted warrior in that you are on top of horseback and you are fighting on top of that horseback. Sorry, I'm realizing that maybe you weren't able to see everything, so I'm going to try to fix that here real quickly, and hopefully that helped you a little bit there. Anyway, hopefully you can see that these mounted warriors, they were trained, they were the elite. You could call them kind of the special forces of the Middle Ages. They were highly trained. Their job was to be warriors. They weren't to harvest food. They weren't to be involved in politics. They were going out and fighting. So let's talk a little bit more about knights and how they came to be. So achieving knighthood was not just something you did. It took work. First of all, you would be sent away at the age of 7 as a boy to train to become a knight. Not every boy. As a boy, you had to have a certain amount of intelligence. You had to have a certain amount of ability to go and join the knighthood. As feudal war decreased from the 1100s, they would meet together in tournaments or mock battles to make sure they could hone in their fighting and their abilities to fight, to make sure they were the best of the best. Knights would compete in these fightings against each other, oftentimes not lethally, but just in competition, who could beat the other person and be the best knight. Sometimes we get some of our famous knights from these legendary tournaments or battles. But let's talk a little bit for a second about noble women. We talk so much about men because most of history is made up of men. Well, let's talk a little bit about noble women for a second and how influential women were. First of all, a woman would have been seen or called the lady of the manor. Women actually enjoyed quite a bit of control. Unlike in Roman time periods, women had quite a bit more abilities than what we see in other past civilizations. So the lady of the manor, if her husband was gone, would actually take over his duties when he was off, especially fighting, which could be oftentimes frequently. And she was in charge of the manor and was supposed to be responded to and to be respected. A few of these noble women actually became politicians. They, like we saw in Egypt and other empires and civilizations, became so powerful that they will themselves take on their own identity, not just through their husband. One of those is Eleanor of Aquitaine. She becomes the first queen of France and later a queen of England. She's one of these ladies that we're talking about. She's really known for her fighting in the Second Crusade. We haven't really talked about the Crusades at all, but in the Middle Ages, the Crusades was a time period that the European Christians went to go fight the Muslims to regain land like Jerusalem and other holy Christian cities. and they would go to fight these Muslims to take those lands. Now, it could be much more summed up that a lot of European men needed more land and more wealth because they were running out of space, and so they went to go take on the Muslims to regain this. And they really weren't overall very successful in a lot of their endeavors. However, Eleanor of Aquitaine is incredibly famous for the Second Crusade, which was much more successful than many of the other crusades. She was very interested in women's rights and their inheritance, and she did not want to be restricted to just a man. And so she set up a system of a dowry. And a dowry, many of you are probably familiar with, but is when a woman gets married to a man, she might have a dowry that is given to her father. Meaning if something happens to her husband, or if he leaves her, or something like that happens, she still has wealth and money. Now, we oftentimes look at dowries and to some degree we should see it as buying and selling women and how horrible this is. But in a lot of ways, people need to remember that dowries were in a way to protect women, a way to help them make sure that they were not reliant just on a man, but that they would have their own success and their own wealth. Now, we could argue and say, well, why didn't they just give the women the money? But there was a lot of legal reasons why they did that. And not to say they weren't sexist at this time, they were. But we shouldn't just sum up dowries as something that people, were doing because they were mistrustful and sexist towards women. So Eleanor of Aquitaine is one of the most famous women from this time period. This idea of chivalry is going to really come out. We have this idea of a knight being a certain way, behaving a certain way towards women. I can tell you at our school, we have certain expectations that men should be a certain way, especially to the women in the community and in school. And I think that's great. It helps men understand their role and how they should be treating women. And chivalry at this time is going to be not exactly, it will be, yes, it does cover this, but it's going to be a much bigger concept than just being good and opening doors for girls and buying, them food and stuff. It's going to be a much bigger idea than that. They're going to adopt this code of conduct called chivalry. As a knight, you take this almost as like if you were in the military and you're taking on a code of conduct as a Marine. Chivalry required knights to be brave, loyal, and true to their word, and fight fairly. We've already talked about that in our vocab. Chivalry applied to every aspect of a knight. It wasn't just when they were fighting, it was every aspect of society. So let's talk about the last part here, the peasants and their manor and their way of living. The heart of the medieval economy was the manor, or the actual lord's estate. Most manors included one or more villages, and then they had surrounding lands as well. And each part of the manor had its own setup. So here you might have what we call citadel, the city built on a hill with walls surrounding it. And many people would live here. The Lord himself, many important clergymen, other people that were high-ranking nobles or people that were working to do things for the kingdom. But you would also have your church, and most of the monks and priests would have lived here. You would have had your water mill to grind up wheat and to do other things like that. You would have had your workshop, like ironsmith or blacksmiths, and your different cobblers and different things like that. And you would have had your pasture land, people who were over livestock feeding their pasture. And you would have also had your different fields. And we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a second, but they had a pretty intelligent way to make their fields stay successful and have high production. So in our medieval manor, we can see that we have our cultivated land. And they would either take a whole field and they would make it fallow, or they would do a couple different rows as being fallow. When we say fallow, what we mean by that is nothing was planted in the field. You might say, well, why on earth would you do that? Why would you have, spring planting, fall planting, but not use this land? That seems kind of stupid. Well, we know today, and most of you probably know, that if you continue to use land without refertilizing it, without getting the nutrients that it needs, you can actually kill the nutrients in the soil, which will make it so that the field will be not productive for food. And the Middle Ages, they were smart. They realized this. And so they would keep one field follow to make sure that once these fields were used, they could then rotate them. And then next year, this one would be follow, and they would have fall planting here or fall planting here and spring planting here. And they would keep rotating this to make sure that they would be successful. Here's just another picture of one that we've already said. A third field being follow, nothing's being done to it. Our second field and our first field. Now, one of these lanes would have been reserved for the Lord. So you would have your people, your serfs, the knights, and everything like that. And then one of these would be just reserved just for the Lord himself. So you can see. Again, we have our church, our manor house, pasture land, our serfs, our workshops. Everything's very organized. Everything's very structured. You don't have these huge cities, but you do have very developed and very organized city structures. In fact, somewhat nice in some ways because it was a very simple lifestyle, but a very organized lifestyle. So let's talk a little bit more about the peasants. And yes, peasants are going to be treated poorly in some ways, but also many of them are going to have things that, all of us have, basic necessities, and they'll be taken care of. So let's talk a little bit about these peasants for a second. Most peasants on a manors were, in fact, serfs. They were bound to the land. They were part of the property. Now, we do separate that they are not slaves, per se. A slave implies that you captured them and that they have no rights at all. A serf might have some rights, but they have a contract. The contract is going to be that the Lord promises to provide for them food, shelter, protection, all of those things. Where a slave, you don't have to do that. You can use them in any way that you want. So there is a slight difference between a serf and a slave. The peasants made up the majority of the population. Serfs, again, were not slaves, but they were not necessarily free either. They couldn't just leave. They were bound to the property. This was a very self-sufficient world. The manor produced everything it needed. They relied on nobody else. Everything was right there in the manor, and they survived on everything that was produced there. There were no schools and no real knowledge of the outside world. People kind of just stayed where they were at and worked themselves without really achieving any kind of social mobility. Nobody went up ranks and became peasant to king. That didn't happen. So we can see that this was a very organized but very simple lifestyle. There was no need for school because you were just tutored or you were becoming an apprentice to somebody in a job that you were going to take over, rather than be a blacksmith or it be a peasant or whatever it might be. And that is the manner and economy life in feudalism at the Middle Ages. Hopefully that's been helpful. Let's just make sure that we've answered our objectives so that way we can have those answered in our notebooks. And so what social structures existed at this time? Well, mainly feudalism. We talked about that here. Feudalism is the main system that is organized and divided their powers. But I also would like you guys to put vassals and feudal contract and 5, because these are all things that are structuring society. In fact, you could probably, and this might even be an easier way to do this, is just take the graphic that I had you guys write, this one here, the feudal pyramid, and just put objective 1 next to it. This is society. This is how it's structured. So you just take this pyramid that you drew, and you could put that in your notebook and put objective 1. How did empires gain more resources? We can see that they went to war with each other, right? They used knights, and they went to war oftentimes against each other, trying to exploit each other's lands. And so they used knights in order to do this, to fight. Okay, so that's the answer to that, objective 2, is the constant, I don't know if you saw that there, the constant fighting, the constant battling for power, and using these knights here. And so our last objective, objective 3, is going to be, what was life like for the majority of people? The majority of your peasants, right? And we talked a lot about that towards the end here. We talked about serfs, we talked about them and what life was like. We talked about the serfs being bound to the land, and the majority of them were serfs or peasants. We talked to you about how they had certain rights, but were also part of the property. And I think this would be a good summary of what kind of life was like for them. Everything was self-sufficient, but there was no real education, no social mobility. You were what you were born into, and you didn't make a fuss. That's what you did. And that pretty much answers all the objectives for our notes here. For our focus question, just to review that for a second here, what controls people? Well, we can see that society structures control people. We've talked about government, military. We've talked about church. But now one thing that we can see is sometimes we control people not really by any direct method, but by more specifically indirect methods. This is who you are. If you've ever woken up and you felt like, well, I'm just this kind of a person. I remember growing up, my father always said, well, I'm not a book learning person. I'm a hands-on person. I need to learn that way. That's more of this idea of how we can control people, is society and the way that it's structured and the way that it keeps people in the environment that it's in is how we control people. Think about that more, about how today, do we continue to just be the same thing that our parents were, or do we grow and change and become something different? Maybe we're better than the Middle Ages, or maybe we're the same. But that is it for section 2 of your notes there.